The morning of February 9th, 1943, near the village of Krasny Bor, southeast of Leningrad. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius overnight. Frozen ground crunched under German boots as sentries changed positions along the forward trenches. Visibility was excellent across the snow-covered fields, the kind of clear winter day that made movement dangerous for both sides. A German Obergefreiter, a senior lance corporal named Klaus Reinhardt, stood watch in a reinforced observation post, scanning the Soviet lines through his field glasses. He had been in Russia for 18 months, survived 2 winters, and developed the cautious instincts that kept men alive on the Eastern Front. He knew to watch for the small irregularities, the slight movements, the places where snow sat differently on objects than it should. Something bothered him about a section of ground approximately 300 meters distant. There was a small rise there, barely, noticeable, covered in snow like everything else. But the snow pattern was wrong, too uniform, too deliberate. He watched it for several minutes, seeing nothing. Then, just for an instant, a tiny flash of reflected light. Sunlight on glass, perhaps, or on ice, or on something else entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Reinhardt stepped back from his observation slit and called for his squad leader. By the time the Feldwebel arrived with his own binoculars, the suspicious position had disappeared. Not moved, not revealed as harmless, but simply gone. The snow looked undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there at all. What Reinhardt had seen, in that brief flash of reflected light, was the edge of a small mirror. The mirror belonged to a Red Army sniper named Vasily Kvachantiradze. The 31-year-old former collective farm worker from Soviet Georgia had constructed what would become his signature hunting technique, a method so effective that by the end of the war, Soviet sniper instructors would teach variations of it in their training programs. The mirror itself was nothing special. It had come from the compact belonging to a German nurse, recovered from an aid station overrun during the Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1942. Kvachantiradze had broken it carefully into several smaller pieces, each about the size of a playing card. He carried them wrapped in cloth in his pack, along with wire, cord, and small wooden stakes he had carved himself during quiet hours in the rear areas. The technique was simple in concept but demanding in execution. Kvachantiradze would dig what he called a double position, 2 fighting holes connected by a shallow trench, all of it carefully camouflaged. In one position, he would set up the mirror at an angle, secured to a stake or piece of wood, positioned to reflect a view of the German lines. In the other position, 20 to 30 meters away, he would wait with his Mosin Nagant rifle. The mirror allowed him to observe without exposing himself. More importantly, it allowed him to observe from a position other than where he actually lay. German snipers and counter-sniper teams were trained to watch for the glint of scope lenses, for the slight movement of a rifle being positioned, for the disturbance of snow or vegetation that indicated a sniper's hide. They watched the logical positions, the places where a sniper should be based on the angles and distances involved. Kvachantiradze was never in those logical positions. He was somewhere else, watching through his mirror, waiting for targets to present themselves while enemy observers scanned the wrong patches of ground. The psychological advantage was as important as the tactical one. German soldiers along his section of the front learned to fear open ground in daylight. They learned that positions which seemed safe, which offered no apparent angle for a sniper shot, could still prove fatal. They learned that the normal rules of cover and concealment did not always apply. To understand why Kvachantiradze's mirror technique represented such a significant tactical innovation, one must understand the nature of warfare on the Eastern Front by early 1943, and particularly the evolution of sniper tactics in the Red Army. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 had caught the Red Army in a state of incomplete modernization. Stalin's purges of the officer corps in 1937 and 1938 had eliminated experienced military leadership. Tactical doctrine was confused, mixing outdated concepts with newer theories that had not been properly tested or implemented. Equipment quality varied wildly, from excellent designs like the 34 tank to inadequate small arms and poor optical equipment. The initial German advance was catastrophic for Soviet forces. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were killed or captured in the first 6 months of fighting. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, driving deep into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Moscow by December 1941 and pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad by summer 1942. But the Soviet military system possessed a capacity for adaptation that German planners had not anticipated. Throughout 1942, as the front lines stabilized and fighting became more positional, the Red Army began systematically studying what worked and what failed. They collected data, interviewed survivors, analyzed German tactics, and developed responses. One area of particular focus was sniper warfare. The Soviets had long maintained an interest in marksmanship, with pre-war shooting clubs and programs like the Voroshilov marksman training, producing millions of citizens with basic rifle skills. But systematic military sniping, the deliberate deployment of specially trained marksmen as a tactical asset, had not been emphasized before the war. German invasion changed that calculation. Soviet commanders observed that skilled marksmen, properly positioned and supported, could impose psychological costs on German forces far beyond the actual casualties they inflicted. A single sniper could paralyze an entire sector, forcing enemy soldiers to move carefully, to avoid exposure, to remain constantly vigilant. This degraded efficiency, slowed operations, and created persistent low-level stress that wore down unit effectiveness over time. The Red Army began establishing formal sniper schools in late 1941. These schools taught fieldcraft, camouflage, range estimation, the technical aspects of the Mosin Nagant rifle and its PE and PU telescopic sights. Students learned to construct hides, to move silently, to read terrain and weather conditions. The training was practical and oriented toward immediate battlefield application. By 1942, sniper sections were being attached to rifle regiments throughout the Red Army. The best marksmen received the sniper designation and the responsibility that came with it. They were expected to hunt German officers, machine gun crews, artillery observers, and other high-value targets. They were expected to maintain detailed logbooks of their kills, with each claim verified by a witness, usually a spotter or the soldier's immediate commander. The verification system was strict, driven by Soviet bureaucratic precision and the need to prevent false claims. A sniper could not simply report killing enemy soldiers and expect credit. Someone else had to confirm the kill through observation or by recovering identification documents from the body. This made achieving high confirmed kill counts difficult, particularly in fluid combat situations where bodies could not be reached or where enemy forces quickly recovered their casualties. Vasily Kvachantiradze entered this system in autumn 1942 after his commanders noticed his exceptional shooting ability during regular infantry combat. He was sent to a 10-day abbreviated sniper course behind the lines, where instructors taught him the basics of the craft. The course was rushed, focused on immediate practical application rather than comprehensive training. Students spent most of their time on rifle ranges, learning to judge distances and compensate for wind, cold, and the peculiarities of Soviet ammunition production. Kvachantiradze returned to his unit with a Mosin Nagant rifle fitted with a PU scope, a magnification of 3.5 times that was modest by Western standards, but adequate for most engagement ranges on the Eastern Front. He received a small allotment of match-grade ammunition, cartridges selected for consistency and accuracy. He was assigned a position in his company's sniper section and told to begin hunting Germans. Soviet sniper doctrine in early 1943 emphasized several key principles, all drawn from combat experience accumulated over 18 months of brutal fighting. First, patience. Soviet instructors taught their snipers to wait for high-value targets rather than shooting at any enemy soldier who appeared. Officers were priority targets, identifiable by their different uniforms, binoculars, and the deference shown by enlisted men. Artillery observers were critical targets, as killing them disrupted German fire support. Machine gun crews were valuable targets because suppressing them allowed Soviet infantry to maneuver. Radio operators, identified by their distinctive backpack sets, were priority targets because their deaths disrupted German communications. Second, concealment through immobility. Soviet doctrine emphasized constructing well-camouflaged positions and remaining absolutely still within them for hours or even days. Movement attracted attention. The human eye was drawn to motion, particularly in the relatively static environment of trench warfare. A sniper who moved frequently was a sniper who would be located and killed. The doctrine taught snipers to build their hides carefully, to move into position under darkness, and then to remain motionless until their mission was complete, or they were forced to withdraw. Third, the importance of escape routes. Soviet snipers were taught never to construct a position that had only one exit. The hide should allow withdrawal through multiple directions, ideally through covered routes that would not expose the sniper to enemy observation. This reflected hard lessons learned in combat. German counter-sniper tactics had evolved rapidly, and German marksmen were skilled at locating and eliminating Soviet snipers who remained too long in compromised positions. Fourth, the use of deception. Soviet doctrine encouraged snipers to create false positions, dummy hides that would draw German attention to fire, while the actual sniper operated from a different location. Decoys could be as simple as a helmet placed on a stick to simulate a soldier's head, or as elaborate as a full mannequin positioned to look like a sniper in a hide. When German observers or counter-snipers engaged these decoys, they revealed their own positions. This emphasis on deception created the conceptual space for Kvachantiradze's innovation. If Soviet doctrine already valued misdirection and false positions, then the logical extension was to create a method where the sniper could observe from one position while shooting from another. The mirror technique was not a rejection of Soviet sniper doctrine, but rather its refinement, taking existing principles and pushing them further. The technical requirements for implementing the mirror system were modest. The mirror itself needed to be small enough to conceal easily, but large enough to provide a useful field of view. Kvachantiradze found that pieces approximately 8 cm by 10 cm worked well. The mirror needed to be positioned at approximately a 45-degree angle to reflect a horizontal view back to the sniper's actual position. This required simple wooden supports that could be carved from available materials and positioned quietly. The construction of Kvachantiradze's double position system began the night before each hunting operation. He would move forward after dark, typically between 11 o'clock in the evening and 2 o'clock in the morning, when German sentries were least alert and Soviet artillery fire provided covering noise. He carried his rifle, ammunition, the mirror pieces, wooden stakes, cord, a small folding shovel, white camouflage fabric, and emergency rations. The selection of terrain was critical. Kvachantiradze looked for areas with slight elevation changes, small folds in the ground, or shallow depressions that would not be obvious to observers, but would provide sufficient depth for a fighting position. He needed ground that was firm enough to dig without excessive noise, but not frozen solid. He needed a location with clear observation lines toward German positions, but also with vegetation, debris, or terrain features that would help camouflage his work. Once he identified suitable ground, he would begin excavating the observation position first. This hole was smaller than his shooting position, just large enough for the mirror assembly and its supports. He dug carefully, removing snow and soil in small amounts, distributing the excavated material thinly over a wide area so no obvious spoil pile would betray the position in daylight. The hole needed to be approximately 30 centimeters deep, enough to recess the mirror below ground level while maintaining the correct angle for reflection. He would construct a simple wooden frame, essentially 2 stakes driven into the ground with cross pieces lashed to them with cord. The mirror mounted on this frame at a 45-degree angle, positioned to reflect a view of the German trenches back toward where his shooting position would be. He covered the entire assembly with white cloth that matched the surrounding snow, leaving only a small opening for the mirror's reflective surface. From German positions, the mirror assembly appeared as just another snow-covered irregularity in the landscape. The shooting position required more extensive excavation. Kvachantiradze needed space to lie prone with his rifle, to move slightly for comfort during long waits, and to have emergency rations and water within reach. This position was typically 20 to 30 meters from the mirror position, placed so that the reflected view from the mirror gave him observation of the German lines while he remained in a location that offered no direct line of sight to those same positions. The geometry was simple but effective. The mirror showed him what was happening in the German trenches 300 meters away, but from the German perspective, there was no position at Kvachantiradze's actual location that should allow observation or engagement of their positions. The angles were wrong. The terrain blocked direct line of sight. Any sniper attempting to shoot from that location should have been unable to see targets. But Kvachantiradze was not shooting at what he could see directly. He was shooting at what the mirror showed him. He would observe through the mirror, identify a target, calculate the angle and distance, then position his rifle to engage that target based on his observation. The rifle aimed at a point that seemed to make no tactical sense, aimed at an angle that appeared to lead nowhere useful. But the bullet's trajectory, calculated from his indirect observation, would intersect with the target he had identified through the mirror. This technique demanded exceptional spatial reasoning and mental calculation. Kvachantiradze had to mentally map the relationship between his position, the mirror's angle, and the target's location. He had to adjust for the fact that the range to target was not the direct distance from his rifle to the enemy soldier, but rather the combined distance from his position to the mirror plus the reflected distance from the mirror to the target. His range estimation had to account for this more complex geometry. The ballistic calculations became more complicated as well. The Mosin Nagant 7.62mm round had a muzzle velocity of approximately 830 meters per second, respectable for a rifle of its era. But the bullet dropped predictably over distance, requiring the shooter to aim higher than the target to compensate for the curved trajectory. Kvachantiradze had to calculate this drop not for a simple straight-line shot, but for his more complex firing geometry. Wind complicated matters further. The bullet's flight path would be affected by wind along its entire trajectory. But because Kvachantiradze was firing at an angle determined by mirror observation rather than direct sight, he had to estimate wind effects along a path he could not directly observe. He learned to read wind indicators, the movement of snow along the ground, the behavior of smoke from German positions, the way fabric moved on enemy uniforms and equipment. Temperature affected bullet performance as well. Cold air was denser, providing slightly more resistance to the bullet's flight. In the extreme cold of the Russian winter, with temperatures regularly dropping below -20 degrees Celsius, this effect was significant enough to require adjustment. The cold also affected the gunpowder in his cartridges, sometimes reducing muzzle velocity and therefore increasing bullet drop. Kvachantiradze learned to compensate through experience, keeping his ammunition as warm as possible next to his body and making small adjustments to his aim based on temperature conditions. His logbook, maintained according to Soviet Sniper Corps regulations, documented his kills with careful precision. Each entry included the date, time, location, range to target, weather conditions, and a description of the target and circumstances. His company commander or political officer witnessed and verified each claim, either through direct observation or by recovery of identification documents from killed German soldiers during subsequent operations. By May 1943, 3 months after he began employing the mirror technique systematically, Kvachantiradze's confirmed kill count had increased from 18 to 94. The German military's response to Soviet sniper tactics evolved throughout 1942 and into 1943 as they recognized the growing threat. Wehrmacht training manuals were updated to include sections on counter-sniper operations. Specialized courses trained German marksmen in sniper hunting techniques. Units began deploying their own snipers specifically to locate and eliminate Soviet snipers. German counter-sniper doctrine emphasized several principles. First, reconnaissance and observation. Counter-sniper teams would study the terrain in their sector, identifying likely sniper positions based on fields of fire, cover, and concealment. They would watch these positions continuously, looking for telltale signs of occupation, the glint of an optical sight, slight movement, disturbed vegetation, or snow. Second, immediate suppression. When a Soviet sniper fired, German troops were trained to immediately lay down suppressive fire on the suspected position, while the counter-sniper team attempted to locate the exact firing point. This created a dilemma for Soviet snipers. They could remain in position, pinned down by suppressive fire and at risk from counter-sniper fire, or they could attempt to withdraw, potentially exposing themselves through movement. Third, deception and baiting. German counter-sniper teams would use decoys to draw Soviet sniper fire, revealing sniper positions. A dummy head raised above a trench line, a mannequin positioned to look like an officer observing through binoculars. These techniques sometimes provoked Soviet snipers into shooting, giving away their locations. Fourth, the use of superior optics. German sniper rifles, typically Mauser Kar-98s fitted with 4-power Zeiss scopes, offered better optical quality and slightly more magnification than Soviet scopes. This provided a small but meaningful advantage in locating enemy snipers before being located themselves. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These German counter-sniper methods were effective against conventional Soviet sniper tactics. The Wehrmacht recorded numerous successes, with German snipers eliminating Soviet snipers who remained too long in compromised positions or who followed predictable patterns. But Kvachantiradze's mirror technique created problems that German counter-sniper doctrine struggled to address. The fundamental issue was that German observers were looking in the wrong places. When Kvachantiradze fired, the muzzle flash came from his actual shooting position. But the logical place for a sniper to be positioned, based on the target's location and the angle of fire, was somewhere else entirely, likely near where his mirror assembly was hidden. German counter-sniper teams would observe the area where they believed the shot originated, but they were observing based on conventional assumptions about how snipers operated. A German sniper named Rudolf Schlegel, serving with the 215th Infantry Division near Krasny Bor in spring 1943, documented his frustration in letters home that were later captured by Soviet forces. In a letter dated April 14, 1943, he wrote about a Soviet sniper operating in his sector who had killed 7 German soldiers over 10 days. Schlegel and his spotter had located what they believed was the sniper's position based on their analysis of firing angles and likely hide locations. They had watched that position for 2 full days, seeing nothing. Then another German soldier was shot, clearly from the same general area, but the angle still made no sense. Schlegel described attempting to plot back the trajectory based on where the bullet struck the victim and what it had passed through, a standard counter-sniper technique. The calculations led to positions that seemed impossible. The terrain did not provide line of sight from those positions to the target location. He began to suspect the Soviet sniper was somehow firing from multiple positions, perhaps moving between shots, though the timing seemed too quick for that explanation. The German solution, when they could not locate a sniper, was typically to call for artillery fire on the general area. This approach was expensive in ammunition, and not always effective, particularly if the Soviet sniper had good escape routes. But it was often the only option when counter-sniper operations failed to locate the threat. The engagement that would later be documented in Soviet sniper training materials occurred on March 27, 1943, in the late morning. The weather was clear and cold, temperature approximately -8 degrees Celsius. German positions had been relatively quiet for several days, following a failed Soviet probe on March 23 that had cost both sides casualties without changing the frontline positions. Kvachantiradze had moved into position the previous night, completing his double-hide construction by 4 o'clock in the morning. He had eaten a small meal of black bread and dried fish, drunk water from his canteen, which he kept inside his coat to prevent freezing, and settled into his shooting position to wait for dawn. His mirror of assembly was in place 30 meters to his front right, angled to show him a section of German trench approximately 320 meters distant. At 7:45, German soldiers began morning stand 2, the routine where troops manned defensive positions at dawn in case of attack. Kvachantiradze watched through his mirror as men moved in the trenches, preparing for another day. He was looking for officers, for anyone who showed authority or carried equipment that marked them as valuable targets. At 8:12, he observed an officer, identifiable by his different uniform coat and the map case he carried. The officer was speaking with several enlisted men, pointing toward the Soviet lines, apparently giving instructions for the day's activities. The range was 320 meters, according to Kvachantiradze's estimation, based on known landmarks. The wind was light, approximately 5 kilometers per hour from his right, cold air moving across the frozen landscape. Kvachantiradze calculated his shot. The total distance the bullet would travel was not 320 meters, but rather approximately 360 meters, once he accounted for the geometry of his position relative to the mirror and the target. He adjusted his aim point slightly left to compensate for wind drift. He adjusted upward to compensate for bullet drop over that distance. His breathing slowed, became controlled and rhythmic. He exhaled partially, held, and pressed the trigger at the natural pause between breaths. The Mosin Nugant fired with its characteristic sharp crack. The recoil pushed against his shoulder. The empty cartridge case ejected, landing in the snow beside him. Through his scope, maintaining his position rather than immediately seeking cover, he watched the impact. The German officer collapsed. The men around him dropped into the trench, seeking cover. Within seconds, German machine guns opened fire, sweeping the area where thought the shot had originated. But they were firing at positions 200 meters from where Kvachantiradze actually lay. He watched through his scope as bullets tore through empty snow, as German soldiers focused their attention on terrain that held no threat. His mirror assembly, carefully camouflaged, drew no fire because it looked like just another small mound of snow among many. His actual shooting position received no attention because from the German perspective, it made no tactical sense as a sniper hide. Kvachantiradze remained motionless for 20 minutes, watching as German soldiers eventually ceased fire and began moving cautiously in their trenches again. At 8:53, a German medic appeared, moving toward a different section of trench, carrying his medical bag marked with red crosses. The medic was not a priority target under most circumstances, as medical personnel were theoretically protected under the Geneva Convention, but Soviet doctrine noted that killing medics could degrade German morale and potentially deny treatment to wounded soldiers who might otherwise survive. Kvachantiradze fired again. The medic fell. Again, German guns opened fire on the wrong positions. Again, Kvachantiradze remained untouched in his actual location. He watched German soldiers becoming increasingly agitated, their suppressive fire less organized now, more panicked. They were being killed by an enemy they could not locate, could not see, could not engage effectively. The psychological impact was visible in their behavior, in the hesitancy with which they moved, in the way they kept their heads down even after the firing stopped. Kvachantiradze's success with the mirror technique did not remain secret within Soviet sniper circles. Red Army doctrine encouraged the sharing of effective tactics between units. Successful snipers were brought to training schools to demonstrate their methods to new students. Written reports on innovative techniques circulated through military channels, particularly when those techniques produced verified results. By summer 1943, Instructors at the Central Women's School of Sniper Training in Podolsk were teaching a variation of Kvachantiradze's mirror method. The school, established in May 1943 to train female snipers for deployment to frontline units, incorporated lessons learned from combat-experienced snipers across all fronts. The mirror technique appeared in training manuals as an advanced method, recommended for experienced snipers operating in static defensive positions where construction of elaborate hides was feasible. The technique was not universally adopted. It required specific conditions to be effective. The terrain needed to allow construction of separated positions with appropriate geometry. The tactical situation needed to be relatively static, as the time required to construct the double hide system made it impractical during mobile operations. The sniper needed exceptional spatial reasoning skills to calculate firing solutions based on indirect observation. Many snipers found the method too complicated or too demanding of time and resources compared to conventional techniques. But for those who mastered it, the results validated the effort. Soviet records from the Leningrad front documented several snipers employing mirror systems throughout 1943 and into 1944. Their survival rates were notably higher than snipers using conventional single-position hides. The misdirection inherent in the mirror system provided crucial protection against German counter-sniper operations, which had become increasingly effective as the war progressed. Kvachantiradze himself continued active duty until he was seriously wounded in January 1944 during the Soviet offensive that finally lifted the siege of Leningrad. A German artillery barrage caught him as he was withdrawing from a forward position. Shrapnel struck his left leg and lower back. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a larger medical facility behind the lines. The wounds were severe enough to end his combat service, but not life-threatening with proper treatment. His final confirmed kill count stood at 215 German soldiers. This figure placed him among the most successful Soviet snipers of the war, though not at the very top of the rankings. Snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko with 309 confirmed kills, or Vasily Zaitsev with 242, achieved higher totals. But Kvachantiradze's contribution lay less in his total numbers than in his methodological innovation, in demonstrating a technique that other snipers could learn and apply. After his recovery from wounds, Kvachantiradze was assigned to training duties. He spent the remainder of the war at sniper schools, teaching new students the fundamentals of marksmanship and fieldcraft. He demonstrated the mirror technique to advanced students, though he emphasized it was not suitable for all situations or all snipers. The technique required patience, careful preparation, and strong mathematical ability to calculate complex firing solutions. Students who lacked these qualities were better served by mastering conventional sniper tactics. The recognition Kvachantiradze received reflected Soviet military culture's approach to decorating successful soldiers. He was awarded the Order of the Red Star in April 1943, a decoration given for exceptional service in the defense of the Soviet Union. He received the Order of the Red Banner in August 1943, a higher decoration reserved for acts of particular bravery and effectiveness in combat. These awards brought small material benefits, modest increases in rations and pay, but more importantly, they brought prestige within the military system. Post-war, Kvachantiradze returned to civilian life in Georgia. He worked in agricultural administration, applying his organizational skills to collective farm management. He married in 1946 and raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, except among other veterans. The psychological burden of having killed more than 200 men, even enemy soldiers in a defensive war, was not something Soviet culture encouraged discussing openly. Veterans were expected to take pride in their service, but not to dwell on the trauma or moral complexity of combat. He died in 1978 at age 66 from heart disease. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime decorations, but provided no details about his sniper service or his tactical innovations. He was buried in a cemetery in Tbilisi alongside other veterans of the Great Patriotic War, as Soviet culture termed the conflict with Nazi Germany. The mirror technique that Kvachantiradze developed and refined represented a small but significant thread in the current, larger tapestry of sniper warfare evolution during World War II. The conflict forced all major combatant nations to develop systematic approaches to sniper employment, moving beyond the ad hoc marksmanship of earlier wars toward professionalized sniper corps with formal training, specialized equipment, and defined tactical doctrine. The Soviet approach to sniper warfare emphasized mass production of competent snipers over the creation of a small elite. Soviet training schools graduated thousands of snipers during the war. Not all were exceptional marksmen, but all received enough training to be effective at ranges of 300 to 400 meters, the typical engagement distances on the Eastern Front. This approach reflected Soviet military philosophy more broadly, favoring quantity and adequate quality over smaller numbers of highly specialized personnel. German sniper doctrine emphasized individual excellence and more extensive training. German sniper schools provided longer courses, typically several weeks compared to the Soviet 10-day abbreviated programs. German snipers received better optical equipment and often came from hunting backgrounds that provided pre-existing marksmanship skills. But Germany produced far fewer snipers overall, lacking both the instructional capacity and the willingness to divert training resources from other critical needs. The British and American approaches differed from both Soviet and German models. British sniper training emphasized patience and concealment, reflecting the nation's hunting traditions and its experience in colonial conflicts where skilled marksmen had proven valuable. American sniper programs developed more slowly, with the Marine Corps taking the lead in creating systematic training after early Pacific combat revealed the need for effective counter-sniper capabilities against Japanese snipers. What made Kvachantiradze's mirror technique noteworthy within this broader context was its emphasis on deception and misdirection rather than pure marksmanship skill or concealment quality. Most sniper training focused on making the sniper invisible in their position, on perfecting camouflage so the enemy could not detect them. Kvachantiradze's method accepted that perfect concealment was difficult to achieve and instead focused on making the enemy look in the wrong place. The sniper's actual position did not need to be perfectly camouflaged if the enemy was searching elsewhere for the threat. This represented a philosophical shift in thinking about sniper employment. Traditional doctrine assumed the sniper fought from a single carefully prepared position, relying on camouflage and stillness for protection. Kvachantiradze's method introduced spatial separation between observation and firing positions, creating geometric complexity that enemy counter-snipers struggled to analyze. The innovation was tactical rather than technical, requiring no new equipment or specialized training beyond what snipers already received. The technique's limited adoption reflected both its demands and its limitations. It required specific terrain conditions and tactical situations. It demanded mathematical ability and spatial reasoning beyond what all soldiers possessed. It took time to implement, making it suitable only for defensive operations in static positions. These constraints meant the mirror technique remained a specialized method rather than becoming standard practice. But for snipers who could employ it effectively, the survival advantage was substantial. German counter-sniper operations that effectively located and eliminated Soviet snipers using conventional techniques often failed against snipers employing the mirror system. The confusion created by firing positions that seemed to make no geometric sense disrupted German analytical methods for locating snipers. This protection allowed skilled snipers to operate longer from the same general area, achieving higher kill counts before being forced to relocate. The broader lesson from Kvachantiradze's innovation was that tactical creativity could compensate for material disadvantages. Soviet optical equipment was inferior to German scopes. Soviet ammunition quality was less consistent than German ammunition. Soviet snipers often operated with less training than their German counterparts, but a clever method that exploited enemy expectations and analytical processes could neutralize these disadvantages, allowing a technically inferior force to achieve superior results through better tactics. This pattern repeated throughout the Eastern Front in various forms. Soviet forces often found themselves outmatched by German equipment quality and tactical proficiency, particularly in the war's early years. But Soviet military culture's emphasis on practical innovation, on learning from combat experience, and rapidly disseminating effective techniques allowed the Red Army to adapt and eventually prevail. Kvachantiradze's mirror technique was one small example of this broader adaptive capacity. The story of Vasily Kvachantiradze and his mirror technique illuminates several truths about warfare that extend beyond the specific context of Eastern Front sniping in World War II. These truths reveal themselves not through grand strategic decisions or technological breakthroughs, but through the small innovations of individual soldiers trying to survive and succeed in desperate circumstances. First, effective innovation often comes from constraint rather than abundance. Kvachantiradze did not have access to superior equipment. His rifle was standard issue. His scope was adequate but not exceptional. His ammunition was military standard, not match grade. He could not overcome his material limitations through resources, so he overcame them through method. The mirror technique required only a small piece of glass, some wooden stakes, and cord, items that could be scavenged or improvised from available materials. The innovation lay not in having better tools, but in using ordinary tools in unexpected ways. Second, tactical innovation requires understanding enemy thinking. Kvachantiradze's technique worked because it exploited German counter-sniper doctrine. German marksmen were trained to analyze firing angles and locate snipers based on geometric analysis of where a shooter must be positioned to achieve observed results. This analytical approach was sound and effective against conventional snipers, but it assumed direct line of sight between sniper and target. By breaking that assumption, by interposing a mirror that allowed indirect observation and complex firing geometry, Kvachantiradze created a problem that German doctrine struggled to solve. Third, the multiplication of effectiveness through method rather than material has profound implications. Kvachantiradze's kill count increased by a factor of approximately 5 after he began systematically employing the mirror technique. This improvement came not from better equipment or more ammunition, but from a better approach to the tactical problem of surviving long enough to engage multiple targets. One farmer from Soviet Georgia, using ingenuity and careful preparation, achieved results comparable to much larger investments in equipment or training. Fourth, the psychological dimension of warfare often proves as important as the material dimension. German soldiers in Kvachantiradze's sector learned to fear movement in daylight. They learned that positions which seemed safe could prove fatal. They learned that their counter-sniper efforts were ineffective against an enemy who operated by rules they did not understand. This psychological burden degraded their effectiveness, made them cautious when aggression might have been more appropriate, and created persistent stress that wore down unit cohesion over time. The German Obergefreiter Klaus Reinhardt, who had first spotted the flash from Kvachantiradze's mirror that morning in February 1943, survived the war. In interviews conducted decades later, he recalled the frustration of fighting an enemy who seemed to possess some technique or knowledge that German forces could not counter. He described the feeling of helplessness when soldiers were shot from directions that should have been safe, when all the training in cover and concealment proved inadequate against a threat that did not follow expected patterns. This feeling was precisely what Kvachantiradze had sought to create. The mirror technique's value lay not only in the German soldiers it killed, but in the much larger number it paralyzed with fear and uncertainty. Every German soldier who moved more cautiously, who hesitated before crossing open ground, who spent mental energy worrying about unseen threats, was a soldier whose effectiveness was diminished, even though they remained physically unharmed. The final truth revealed by this small story is that warfare's decisive factors often operate at scales below what strategic histories typically record. Histories of World War II discuss army groups and divisions, campaigns and offensives, production figures for tanks and aircraft. These macro-level factors ultimately determined the war's outcome, but the experience of individual soldiers, fighting in small sectors of vast fronts, was shaped by much smaller innovations and techniques that never appeared in strategic appreciations. For the German soldiers who died from Kvachantiradze's rifle, the strategic situation was irrelevant. For the Soviet soldiers whose sectors Kvachantiradze helped defend, his presence was tactically decisive regardless of larger operational contexts. War at the individual level remained intensely personal, shaped by specific techniques and specific innovations that meant the difference between survival and death. Kvachantiradze's mirror technique survives today primarily in specialist literature, in the Preflugsbind, detailed histories of Soviet sniper operations, in the memoirs of veterans who encountered it or employed variations of it. Modern military sniper training occasionally references the technique as a historical example of tactical deception, though contemporary technology has largely superseded the need for such improvisation. Remote observation systems, thermal optics, and advanced ballistic computers provide modern snipers with capabilities that make mirror-based indirect observation unnecessary. But the underlying principle remains valid. The principle that effective tactics can compensate for material disadvantages. The principle that understanding and exploiting enemy expectations can create disproportionate advantage. The principle that individual innovation, arising from the harsh necessities of combat, can produce methods that prove more effective than institutionally developed doctrine. These lessons transcend specific techniques and specific wars. They illuminate fundamental truths about human conflict that remain constant across changing technology and evolving military systems. The farmer from Georgia, who learned to use a broken mirror to become 5 times more deadly than before, was not a hero in the conventional sense. He was not particularly brave in the dramatic way that earns medals and monuments. He was instead something perhaps more valuable to military institutions. He was creative under constraint, methodical under pressure, and willing to think carefully about problems that others approached through routine. His contribution to Soviet victory was microscopic compared to industrial production or strategic decisions. But for the more than 200 German soldiers who died at ranges they thought were safe, from angles they thought were impossible, his contribution was absolute and final. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.